Hello, I'm Dr. John Cruz, and today I'm going to be talking about ADHD and fish oil and whether it works or not. So I'll be talking for about 20 minutes. If you have questions while I'm talking, you can certainly type them in and I'll answer them at the end of the presentation. If you have questions later when this is posted on Facebook or YouTube, you can also ask questions there. So there have been more than 25 different studies published on the use of fish oil for helping to improve ADHD symptoms. Almost all of these studies, as is the bulk of research in the ADHD realm, have been done on children and young adult or teenagers, not even young adults. So it's harder to extrapolate in this area to adults, but in general, many of the things that seem to work in children do seem to work in adults as well. And parts of what's affecting the possible differences in results of different studies is that there's a variety of different products out there. There's a variety of different dosages that have been studied. There are two main omega-3 fatty acids. One's called EPA, or eicosapentaenoic acid. The other is DHA, or docosahexaenoic acid. And some of the studies focused on one of those, some focused on the other, and many of them use pills that contain both of them. And throughout the natural world, whether it's a fish or a bear or a human, across the animal kingdom, usually there's about a 2-to-1 ratio of EPA to DHA found in our bodies. So I will summarize the findings, and that is they are very weakly positive, and the strongest positive studies seem to be from some of the less well-designed, that the more objective the criteria. So one recent meta-analysis looked at 7 different studies that used the Conners scale, which is one of the most widely used scales to measure ADD symptomatology, and did not find any statistical difference between control groups and the fish oil groups. Other groups have found weak evidence. There's not any clear-cut evidence that it's harmed anyone. Looking at, there's a sign that they're having trouble with this video. We're back. So why might this be helpful? My summary is that it may well help some people. We don't know whether it helps everyone a little bit, or it helps some people, some, and others not at all. And clearly, none of the studies suggest that this is as potent effect as people get from stimulants. There are some claims so that it helps people to use lower doses of stimulants, or people who have almost manageable symptoms of ADHD to be manageable with fish oil and without stimulants. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what omega-3 and fatty acids are and why they may be helpful. So the omega-3 fatty acids, the polyunsaturated fatty acids, are what we call essential items, and that means people need them to remain alive, and more than just that they need them, they need to get them from an external source. So like vitamins, these are things that your body cannot make in of its own. So you need to get polyunsaturated, they're also abbreviated as PUFA, polyunsaturated fatty acids. Now there's 2 big groups of polyunsaturated fatty acids. There's the omega-3s and the omega-6, and the number just says where in this big long branched fatty acid there is a double bond in the 3 position or in the 6 position, but there are important physiologic differences between the 2 groups. So the hypothesis, and it's pretty well supported both by archaeologic evidence and anthropologic evidence, is that ancestral diets contained roughly equal amounts of omega-3s and omega-6s. And this was because protein, the biggest source of protein for virtually every human population known, was fish. I mean, we settled along river banks and on sea coasts where fish are a cheap and convenient source of protein. That's been part of the human diet in many cultures, not absolutely everyone, but many of them. I guess the Maasai in Central Africa, who most of their protein sources from milk and blood, those would be an exception, but most populations had fish. Fish are a good source, particularly ocean fish, but fish are a good source of omega-3s. Flaxseed is a source of omega-3. Walnuts are a source of omega-3. I don't know any cultures that are primarily walnut and flaxseed dependent. On the other hand, the omega-6s are in all of our other vegetable oils. So cotton oil, I'm blanking on the safflower oil, all the olive oil, all the oils that are used in cooking, all the oils that are used in, substituted out for each other for what's ever cheap, and all of our processed foods contain high amounts of omega-6s. So the American diet, not a junk food diet, but a healthy, balanced American diet contains way more omega-6s than omega-3s. So we are relatively omega-3 deficient. Now, there are products out there that will supplement you with both omega-3s and 6s, and unless you have an extremely rare genetic condition where you're deficient in both, I would run screaming away from anyone who's taking more omega-6s, because all of us are getting big amounts of omega-6s in our diet. And again, it's the ratio that's skewed. So if you're taking more omega-6s, it's defeating the purpose. You need to get more omega-3s, ostensibly to restore that ancestral balance and get closer to a 1-to-1 ratio. So why are these things important? What do they do in the body? So there's 3 different physiologic reasons these have been studied for possible effects on the central nervous system, and studied in depression more so than in ADD, and the data for depression is more robust than it is for ADHD for these helping. But so the 3 ways omega-3 supplementation may help are, number 1, this is really a case of you are what you eat. So if you eat a diet rich in omega-6, like most of us are doing, a substantial amount of both DHA and EPA are incorporated into cell membranes. Those are the omega-3s. If you're eating an omega-6 rich diet, you have cell membranes that are rich in omega-6s and relatively deficient in DHA and EPA. On the other hand, if you have more DHA and EPA, more of the omega-3s in your diet, you have a more balanced ratio of fatty acids in your cell membranes. Well, who cares which fatty acids are sitting around in your cell membranes? So one of the things that these fatty acids do as they're sitting in the cell membranes is that they determine the fluidity or flexibility of the cell membrane, and specifically in the nervous system. So they have some effect on how well receptors, which are usually proteins or protein and sometimes carbohydrate attachment processes spanning the cell membranes, how well those receptors function. And at least in the test tube, you can see that in omega-6 enriched cell membrane causes dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin receptors to behave somewhat differently than if you're an omega-3 rich cell membrane. So again, that's a very plausible mechanism by which we could be affecting neural communication in the brain. So again, the theory there would be we're deficient in omega-3s, some of our receptors aren't working as efficiently or smoothly, and bumping up the omega-3 may help those neurotransmitter receptors behave in a more normal, ancestral, historical way. So that's one. Second thing, and I've seen this floating around several of the ADD chains and links, is a claim that the omega-3s boost dopamine synthesis. And I would say the evidence we have right now weakly supports that, but it's absolutely clearly not as simple as take fish oil, make more dopamine. The connection seems to be that particularly the DHA, which is more concentrated in nerve cell membranes, the DHA and EPA, particularly in developing brains, are important for the development and maybe later in life or on an ongoing basis important for the survival of dopaminergic neurons that are making and using dopamine. And therefore, if you have omega-3 deficient neurons or body, then you may have trouble making enough dopamine. And there's at least some studies, I believe it was in rats, non-human studies, where specifically genetically engineered omega-3 deficient rat, which was producing lower amounts of dopamine in certain brain pathways that we think are important for ADHD, when those rats were fed a high omega-3 diet, they did produce more dopamine. But that's a jump from saying everyone taking fish oil is going to have more dopamine synthesis. Again, dopamine seems to play a strong role in ADHD symptoms, so this may be important for some people. It may be somewhat a little important in lots of people, but it's pretty clearly not just a case that take fish oil, boost your dopamine. That's not just a generalizable statement I can make. So the third level by which taking fish oil may conceivably help the brain work better, or may help specifically in certain what we're calling disease states like depression, anxiety, or ADHD, is that one of the other big things, other than just getting incorporated directly into cell membranes, one of the things that your body does with omega-3 or omega-6 fatty acids is to convert them into prostaglandins. And prostaglandins are, you could think of them as sort of like hormones. So they are signaling chemicals that give triggers to other systems to either ramp up or ramp down or regulate other systems in the brain. And the omega-6 fatty acids get broken down in the body to prostaglandins that are pretty clearly pro-inflammatory. So if you have diets rich in omega-6s, as almost all of us do, you are setting up your diet to be a pro-inflammatory diet. And there's good evidence, and again, it's more robust in depression and anxiety, where half of the people with depression have signs both of whole body hyperactive inflammation states and brain hyperactive inflammation states. Again, there's growing evidence that this is true in many, or if not a majority, of individuals with ADHD. How that inflammation directly causes ADHD or causes depression is less clear, and it may just be a correlation, but this is an area of growing research. So what do the omega-3s do? The omega-3s are broken down into prostaglandins, not that shut off the immune system, but that regulate it a little more finely, sort of dampen down the over-ramping up that the omega-6s do. So again, here the theory would be, if we're restoring an ancestral balance to our fatty acids, polyunsaturated fatty acids, we are restoring our immune system to a state of greater balance, greater regulation, rather than running away over inflammation, which may be part of how the problem going on in ADHD, and almost certainly is part of the problem going on for many people with depression or anxiety. So again, my summary is that the evidence so far is pretty weak. It's almost non-existent for adults. The evidence that it would be harmful is completely lacking. There's one or two theoretical concerns, so we'll get into those. And there's just one, I'd say, real-world pragmatic issue with fish oil, is that some people have fishy burping associated with it. That seems to vary a lot from person to person. It seems to vary a lot from brand to brand. My belief is that some of this may well be not even the omega-3 fatty acids themselves, but the breakdown or oxidation products, because I've taken one brand reliably for years, and only once did one bottle that was that clearly associated with fatty acids. So I think leaving it out in the sun, sunlight breaks down, oxidizes the fatty acids to other compounds that are smellier than the fish oil themselves. So if you see a dusty old bottle in the pharmacy or drugstore or grocery store, don't buy that one. If you store it at home, don't store it in a sunny condition. Keep it in the dark. And many people actually keep their fish oil capsules in the freezer, which also may slow down oxidation and also probably prevents most of the digestion until they're further along in the digestive system. Other potential side effects, there have been reports that on massive amounts, and in one study for bipolar disorder, they were using 7 grams of omega-3 fatty acids, or 7,000 milligrams, which was 20 to 21 capsules, I think, of that product. When you're consuming huge volumes of oil, you may likely have some diarrhea or loose stools. I've not seen that be a problem with any of the smaller doses that we're more often recommending, and I'll get to recommendations in just a second. I've seen at least one person who did have a allergic reaction to one of the, it's actually a Walgreens generic brand. They had rashes on their body. Their response to other brands of fish oil was not an allergic reaction, so it might have been some contaminant or intentional inclusion there. The recommendation is for people who have been allergic to fish or shellfish to be cautious in trying that, and if they have an allergic reaction, certainly don't repeat it, but allergic reactions are not common with fish oil supplements. So some of the other concerns are, given that these generally come from fish, and an even more dismaying factor is that some of the omega-3 fish oil, and even with fish oil on the label, and some of the brands actually came from seals, particularly the baby seals that they club in Canada for their pelts and harvest them for the pelts. They don't waste the bodies. Some of that's converted into fish oil. I don't know a good way to determine whether your product is baby seal made or fish oil made, but anyway, our wild fish, even in deep Pacific fish, have contaminants because we've been polluting our oceans, and particularly cultivated fish, including cultivated salmon, have higher levels of contaminants. The two big groups of contaminants that are concerning are mercury and heavy metals. For almost all the products out there of fish oil, they use a distillation process, and the amount of fish oil you'd get on a daily basis is less than you'd be getting from eating a can of tuna a day. So heavy metals is probably not an acute worry for most people. There are other contaminants, particularly polychlorinated biphenyls, that are fat soluble and may not be as readily removed from the fish oil. Again, I have not seen any evidence that people who've taken these daily for years have run into any problems with that. And there's also a question, particularly at massive dosages, and that the double bond is what's called an unsaturated bond. Those are susceptible to oxidation or combining with electrons, and oxidative processes in the body in general are associated with destruction of complicated or damage to complicated proteins and DNA and other molecules that are sensitive to oxidation. So possibly really high doses may increase the oxidative stress. From what I've seen so far, that's a more theoretical risk. So I usually, for people who are interested in seeing if it helps with ADHD, I recommend what's sort of been more established in the depression literature, and that is starting with a dosage of about 1,000 milligrams of EPA a day. So jumping back a little bit, across the natural kingdom, animals, mammals, fish, birds, we have about a 2-to-1 ratio of EPA to DHA. There's a Harvard professor who makes his own EPA-enriched brand of fish oil. There are other EPA-only brands. There's even rarer DHA-only brands. I think Mother Nature is at least as smart as any Harvard psychiatrist, and if she puts 2-to-1 ratio across the animal kingdom, that's probably a good idea. Again, do not buy products unless you have a very specific, very rare condition that also contain omega-6s, because that would be defeating your attempts to reassert a more natural omega-3 to 6 ratio. But most of the products out there, unless they're EPA specific, have about a 2-to-1 EPA to DHA ratio. So you don't need to worry too much about it. Just don't start with an EPA pure version, and getting about 1,000 milligrams of EPA, so that usually would be about 500 milligrams of DHA as well, is a general starting point. If after a month or two you're seeing improvement with that, and it often takes a month or two, some people say 3 whole months to see improvement. If you're seeing some improvement and feel like there's room for more, then I would try bumping up at that time. But if you don't see a subsequent increase in benefit, I would go back to the lower original, again, about 1,000 milligram of EPA amount. And there is a trick or two reading the labels. In the last decade, the manufacturers have learned that many people know 1,000 milligrams as a buzzword. Almost every bottle in the grocery store of fish oil will say either 1,000 milligram or 1,200 milligrams, knowing that's what people pay attention to. Do not pay attention to the front label. Almost always they are including inactive ingredients and other things and not referring to how much EPA is in each capsule. So you need to look at the back label, look to see how much EPA is really there, and closely pay attention to whether it's saying each pill or each serving, because the cheapo brands will say each serving is 300 milligrams of EPA. So you think, aha, I need about 3 servings, which would be 3 pills, but then in little print somewhere else it says each serving is 3 pills. So you'd actually need 9 pills of that just to get to 1,000 milligrams of EPA. So again, the evidence is weak. I do not yet have any patients who swear by marked improvements from it for ADHD. I do have a handful over the years who've had marked success for their depression, and many more with depression who felt it added some benefit. And if you have any questions, I'm not seeing any questions coming in, so I will be signing off in a minute. Next week's topic is going to be more, I guess, educational than advice-laden, and it's called, people had questions about ADHD across the trajectory of life. So that will be next week's topic. Stay safe, stay sane, and I'll see you next Friday at 11. Bye.